Over the weekend, I read the Wall Street Journal and a review of a new book called Lincoln's Peace. It's a little bit of a projection of what would have happened had there not been an assassination. But one of the telling points in the review was there never was an end to the Civil War. There never was a peace treaty. Now, we know about Appomattox, right? And after Appomattox, the guns were put down. We think that was the end, but it wasn't, because Johnson was still being chased by Sherman, right here in Laurinburg, going north to Fayetteville to the Armory. The war goes on, and then in 1865, 25,000 troops are sent to the Mexican border because of guerrilla warfare. So the war never officially ended. You know why? Because you can't have a peace treaty with insurrectionists. You can only have a peace treaty with another nation. So that's the reason that I can say to you over and over again, it never ended. And we're still influenced, I think, very deeply by that. Now, that's the end. We have 3 weeks about the beginning. And the question, of course, is, could it have been avoided? Was there a possibility that one of the worst parts of the entire history of the United States could have been sidestepped? And that's why Dr. Martinez has come to help us figure that one out. Jaime, thrilled to have you.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here, and thank you for inviting me to come back. I was saying to Bob earlier this year, I feel like I've run out of things to talk to you guys about. You have me here so often, but we keep finding new questions or new ways to sort of rethink things that we've talked about before. And of course, you have people who've come here who weren't here when I started talking to you 6 years ago or whatever. So we'll keep going, and I'm always happy to come back. And Bob asked me today to talk about, or this 3-week, this three session kind of visit to talk about what caused the Civil War. So I'm going to turn to Abraham Lincoln as an authority on the subject. I thought about throwing you a little April Fool's curveball, but I'm being recorded and I don't want things to be later taken out of context. Obviously, slavery caused the Civil War, right? As Lincoln said in the second inaugural, everyone knew that slavery was somehow the cause of the conflict. Nobody disputed that at the time. In the aftermath, starting with Jefferson Davis in his memoirs, you will start to see Confederates and other white Southerners saying it wasn't really about slavery, it was something else. But they didn't say that leading up to it or during it, just once they knew they'd lost. Right? And our question for these 3 weeks then is, what is the somehow? How exactly did slavery cause the Civil War? How did it cause the specific Civil War that took place and not some entirely different conflict in another way and at another time? To put it another way, and a question that, sounds like it belongs on a freshman final exam, was the Civil War inevitable? I don't think my freshman could define inevitable right now, but we'd get there. Was the Civil War inevitable? And this is a question that is sort of perennial among scholars, among Civil War fans, among people who like to talk about politics and society in the 19th century. And as one of my graduate school mentors, Ed Ayers, always said, if you say yes to this question, that the Civil War was inevitable, you then have to ask the next question: when did it become inevitable? How did it become inevitable? Just saying, yes, it was slavery is too easy. We have to figure out the somehow. Just saying, yes, it was inevitable is too easy. Because, like, was it inevitable in 1619 when the first African slaves were brought to Virginia, but the rest of the British colonies hadn't even been established yet? Even perhaps more to the point, the United States Civil War was not inevitable before there was a United States. We can all kind of go with that at least, right? So until the American Revolution, a lot of things happened, right, that could have gone a different way. And there's a lot of moments where Virginians, for example, in the 1670s, chose African slavery as the primary labor source they were going to pursue moving forward. Where Carolina colony was settled in the 1660s for the purpose of recreating the slave society of the Caribbean, but not really finding the cash crop that would make that work until 1710 when they start planting rice. A lot could have happened in between there. There are moments where people make choices up until then, but we're going to skip ahead a little bit because we don't have time to deal with everything. Plus, again, I think we can't really talk about the United States Civil War until we have a United States. So let's start in 1776, which is about to get a lot of attention. I'm already getting a lot of emails about America 250, and every county needs a America 250 committee. If anyone wants to do that in Scotland County, happy to participate. To celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, coming up in, of course, 2026. This is I have a lot of primary source quotes for us today that we'll try to make sense of, but I'd love to hear what you think of them and what you think they mean. And so I'm definitely going to look for some audience participation here today. So if we read this from Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence, and this is the part of the Declaration where he's listing all of the crimes of the king, all of the ways that the king has become a tyrant in his treatment of the colonists. And he says, he, King George III, has waged cruel war against human nature itself, violating its most sacred rights of life and liberty in the persons of a distant people who never offended him, captivating and carrying them into slavery in another hemisphere, or to incur miserable death in their transportation thither. If we translate that, what is he talking about? The transatlantic slave trade. King George has waged cruel war by participating in, he did not start, but participating in the transatlantic slave trade. I love this next sentence. This piratical warfare, the opprobrium, I don't even know how to pronounce that, I've only ever read it on paper, of infidel powers is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain. It's throwing a little shade at King George. Determined to keep open a market where men should be bought and sold, he has prostituted his negative for suppressing every legislative attempt to prohibit or restrain this execrable commerce. Prostituted his negative is a term you don't hear very often. We know that Parliament attempted to put some restrictions on the transatlantic slave trade, and King George vetoed them. Right? And so Jefferson is at least suggesting here, I don't know what evidence he has, that the king maybe got some financial kickbacks on that veto. Right? He is now exciting those very people to rise in arms against us and to purchase that liberty of which he has deprived them. Right? So Jefferson is upset that the king continues to support the transatlantic slave trade, despite having opportunities to perhaps pull Britain out of it, or at least limit it. And he's upset that the king is supporting the idea that slaves in the colonies might be armed to fight against their masters. Right? which are two completely different things to be concerned about, and maybe deserved separate clauses. Right? The second one is much more perhaps personal to Jefferson himself, given that he has 200 plus enslaved people on his property, and also fits better with the rest of the Declaration, which is about the ways that the king is potentially oppressing his subjects, the English colonists in North America. Right? The first is kind of out of left field. If you're a fan of 1776, which I certainly am because I'm a geek, it's a musical about history. It's like everything I love. You know what happened after this clause was discussed and debated in the Second Continental Congress, which is the delegates from South Carolina, North Carolina, and Georgia got up and walked out and refused to sign the Declaration of Independence until all of this was taken out, the whole thing. And eventually, the rest of the Congress had to go along with removing it. Jefferson, made his case for why it needed to be there. Adams supported it initially, so did Franklin, but they eventually said, look, we gotta get the thing through and create a country before we can fix any of the problems you've brought up here. It's an interesting moment, though, right? If we're thinking about, is conflict over slavery inevitable, and what can be done to either prevent or forestall it? Even talking about it, even suggesting in writing that something pretty much every man in that room, if you got them to sit down privately, would say they're not fans of, the transatlantic slave trade, right? But putting this harsh condemnation, and actually some of the strongest words used against King George in the document, in the Declaration of Independence, was too much for them. And they absolutely, with justification, accused the New England states of hypocrisy because the New England states were the ones running the ships that fueled the transatlantic slave trade. Nobody's hands are clean in any of this. Right? But we do get this sense of like, it's your fault because you're the ones who are using the slaves that are being brought over. And so eventually, right, this is taken out. The Declaration moves forward without any reference to slavery, and the nation is founded. And we also get a few other things, other key sort of steps along the way. In 1780, the state of Pennsylvania, acting under its new constitution and its new sense of itself as a state in an independent nation, even though the war was not over, the states began acting as if it were. 1780, Pennsylvania passed an act for the gradual abolition of slavery. And this is a lengthy document. I've given you two, I think, kind of crucial excerpts here of like what it actually did. But there's a long intellectual, ideological foundation at the beginning of the document where they say, we are engaged in a battle for our liberty, and it's a just and beautiful thing, and in return, we should give liberty wherever we have the opportunity to do so. Let's be men of our word, and if we value human freedom, then we value it for everyone, and not just ourselves. And there's a whole section where they say, it is not for us to understand or judge why God created men with lots of different physical features and complexions. God did it, God is always right, and we think it's beautiful and enriching that the world looks very different and there are so many different people in it. This is a good thing, right? So if we believe, and you can sort of see the Quakerism in this document, believing those two things, right, that God made all people and God wants all people to be free, the only logical thing we can do is enact the abolition of slavery. But we're going to do it gradually, which feels like a contradiction to all these statements they just made. And so there's two key clauses. There's actually, well, in between these two things, there's a lot going on. But I love this. All persons, right? And we mean people of color, not just white persons, right? We're saying it right here. Born in this state are born free. Regardless of the condition of the mother, regardless of any prior laws that might exist, right? If you're born in this state, you are born free. It then lays out all sorts of rules for apprenticeship of the children of enslaved women until those children reach the age of 21. Everyone currently enslaved continues to be enslaved. Right? So if you're born like the day before the act goes into effect, you're really out of luck. Right? Although there's a lot of incentives put into the law as well to encourage slaveholders to emancipate enslaved people, particularly over the age of 30. Right? So there's a lot of we're going to use various means at our disposal to try to eliminate slavery and phase it out instead of doing it immediately. Every person who's sort of legally held in slavery at the moment the act goes into effect also has to be registered and counted and tracked in very specific terms because of this last clause where they say nobody else can be brought into this state in a state of slavery. Right? Specifically, we are banning the importation of enslaved people through the transatlantic slave trade into our state. Right? We are banning as well people who are residents, who plan to become residents of this state from bringing slaves with them and setting up a farm or plantation or business or anything else run by slave labor. Right? There's a clause that this is a long document, that says we're not going to chase down fugitives if we, once people make it here, if they're living here, they're free. Right? And particularly at the end, we get this statement that says domestic slaves, except for domestic slaves attending upon delegates in Congress from the other American states, or foreign countries, or people passing through the state not as residents, for a term of up to 6 months. So under Pennsylvania law, Thomas Jefferson can bring his slaves with him while he's serving in Congress. But if that person is there 6 months and a day, they are free. And so what the Southern members of Congress who, consistently bring personal servants with them, and again, even some from northern states at this point, people bringing it's more common for northeastern New England and mid-Atlantic wealthy people for their household servants to be English indentured servants than African slaves. But if they either way, these are not free persons, right? So whoever you're bringing with you, who's in a state of unfreedom, can't stay for more than 6 months. And so they get these rotations of their household staff who go back and come back. And the Washingtons cook, they would send him to Virginia for a week because they couldn't live without him for very long. And then he'd come back during the Washington administration, or I guess during the Articles of Confederation and Continental Congress years, right? So Pennsylvania sort of gets things moving in a direction, but this is not complete abolition.
As Native Americans weren't specifically mentioned, how were they covered under this, or just the same as other states?
So I think, right, because they're not specifically mentioned in the document, but the same provisions would have applied, that there's room for indentured servitude under the law, or again, if somebody's already enslaved, they continue to be enslaved, but they can't be born into slavery. And so it's an open question, right? In part because the new Pennsylvania Constitution does not consider Native Americans citizens of Pennsylvania, but also they're not Negroes or mulattoes. So they live in this like dicey territory, as we've frequently heard. But certainly it was very common for them to be serving as indentured servants. And we see Pennsylvania continue to have indentured servitude be a wide practice, and this is sort of everywhere. Indentured servitude continues to be widely practiced into the early 1800s. Right? Sort of phases out. Significant drop in the aftermath of the election of 1800 and this sort of new rhetoric of the Jeffersonian administration of personal freedom and democracy and all these things. And then certainly with the War of 1812 and the rise of early industry, it just becomes an unsustainable thing, indentured servitude, right? But it is still existing, right? And technically still legal under these laws. So Pennsylvania in 1780 becomes the first state to begin a process of emancipation. Massachusetts, it happens through the courts rather than through legislation. So this woman, Elizabeth Freeman, was enslaved by a lawyer. At the time, she was usually called Mom Bet, and she heard the conversations going on around her while her employer, her master, John Ashley, was helping write the new state constitution that starts, all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights. And she went to another lawyer, a neighbor, and said, hey, does that mean I'm free? What do you think? I think it means I'm free. And the lawyer, Sedgwick, Theodore Sedgwick, I think, said, I think you're right. Let's see what the courts think. And a jury found that, in fact, Elizabeth Freeman and the other slaves of John Ashley should be granted their freedom because under the terms of the state constitution, they were born free and equal. And at the same time, there's a series of lawsuits working their way through regarding an enslaved man named Quock Walker, about who we do not have as much information or an image of any sort. Right? And those lawsuits make it to the state Supreme Court in 1783, where in part based on the jury trial of Elizabeth Freeman and the other Ashley household slaves, the Supreme Court of Massachusetts says, the idea of slavery is inconsistent with our own conduct and our state constitution. There can be no such thing as perpetual servitude of a rational creature. Enslaved men and women are people, and our Constitution says all people are born free. Therefore, slavery is null and void in the state of Massachusetts by judicial edict. Now, in practical terms, it takes a long time for that to get worked out. There's a lot of lengthy apprenticeship of people who've been set free, where they live in a system of indentured servitude for several years, sometimes more than several. Right? So that Massachusetts, while in name certainly a free state after 1783, is still in the process of becoming one for the rest of the century, right? Just like Pennsylvania. But we are starting to see some things align. And these places where slavery has existed, but was less foundational to the economy, less foundational to the kind of social and legal structures written in place to support that economy, right, are going to start saying, hey, we could probably get rid of it and it wouldn't affect it much. Right? And so other New England states follow Massachusetts' lead, right? And we start to see the emergence of free states and slave states, right? Which of course now by the time we get to the Constitutional Convention, we have free states and slave states, which we did not have at the time of the Second Continental Congress. Everyone had slavery. By the time we write the Constitution, we have these divisions. And it's not just the original 13 states. There's new states being created. The earliest ones, Tennessee and Kentucky, follow their neighbors, Virginia and North Carolina, and function much like an extension of them in their settlement period, and become slaveholding areas without really much plan for their settlement. Congress came up with a plan for what they called the Northwest Territories, what we would, of course, now today consider the Midwest, the Great Lakes region. This is the space where people hadn't been going, white Americans hadn't been moving in large numbers prior to 1780, so Congress kind of had what they saw, because they ignored all of the native people there, but what they saw as an open field to enact their sort of perfect vision of how society could work and how settlement could work. And so they imposed these grids so that everything is a square and meets in right angles, and they create this concept of a township where every community has plots of land set aside for the good of the community, and plots of land to be sold specifically to fund things like education. And they came up with a plan for these areas to be turned into states and be admitted, and they're very clear that these areas will not be like second-class citizens in the pantheon of statehood. All states are states with the same rules and expectations, rights and privileges, and responsibilities. But one thing they said in 1787, which is the first time the U.S. Congress, and of course this is the Articles of Confederation Congress, the Constitution has not been written yet, there will not be slavery in these 5 territories. We will not expand slavery into this space. And when the states write their state constitutions, they all reaffirm that. They reaffirm that slavery will not exist in those states, and most of the 5 also prohibit free people of color from living in those states, or free people of African descent from living in those states. So it's not all happy. It may have been, right, that they're not setting themselves up as a place that slaves can run away to. Right? They are not interested in being a haven for runaway slaves. Right? I think that's part of it, that they're going to make that clear from the beginning. I think also it's just a sense of like, well, why would white people want to live near black people if they're not enslaving them? So, sure, right? Let's prohibit black people from coming here. Ohio seems to be the most likely to ignore that as we move forward. A lot of the biggest battles over runaway slaves happen in Ohio. But Abraham Lincoln will point to this later as his sort of logic for why it is acceptable to limit the expansion of slavery into territories. Because the very first Congress, the Congress inhabited by people who then helped write the U.S. Constitution, did it. And so why can't the next Congress, or the 50th, or whatever we are at by 1860? Right? So that's pre-Constitution, right? It's halfway through our first meeting, and we haven't even gotten to the U.S. Constitution yet. So let's look at the U.S. Constitution and the 3 clauses we often point to when we talk about slavery. So the first is commonly known as what? If we read this, representatives and direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included in this union according to their respective numbers, which shall be determined, this is how we count, which shall be determined by adding to the whole number of free persons, including those bound to service for a term of years, and excluding Indians, 3/5 of all other persons. So we tend to call this the 3/5 clause or the 3/5 compromise. Because once they decided that rather than one vote per state, like you had under the Articles of Confederation, the new Congress would have a representative body based on population. And big states would get more votes than small states. Then they had to figure out, how do we determine the population? Who counts? Who counts as a person? Are we talking population of eligible voters? Which case, men who own property who are over the age of 21? Are we talking about population of adults? Total population? How do we count? And technically this clause, this compromise of enslaved people count as 3/5 of a person, right? 3/5 of all other people, 3/5 of enslaved people. This compromise position, I have no idea how they came to 3/5 instead of a half or a third or 2/3 or whatever other number you could consider, right? Technically applies to both representation, which means the House, but also the Electoral College, right? And it applies to direct taxation. The catch is, the U.S. government imposes no direct taxes prior to the end of slavery, right? So really, that part doesn't matter, right? That was the part that was supposed to be like, hey, this, is potentially good or bad, but then if you like 3/5 being added for representation, you probably don't like 3/5 being added for taxation, and vice versa. So everyone's happy, right? It's a compromise. A couple things we know. If instead of this, representation had just been based on the number of free persons, John Adams would have won re-election in 1800. It's possible that Thomas Jefferson would never have been president. If enslaved people had been counted as a whole person, right, there's a couple of elections, actually, either way. If we don't count enslaved people at all in population, or if we count them as whole people in population. The election of 1848 would have gone differently either way, right? Which is interesting, because it's not just about, because it suggests that politics in 1848 wasn't just about do you have slaves or not, right? Because because giving the slave states more votes would have made the outcome more clear, and giving the slave states fewer votes would have made the outcome more clear. We'll talk about that later. The point here, though, is that some sort of compromise had to be made between the slave states and the free states. And remember, at this point in time, New York and New Jersey, quite large states, particularly New York is a large state, were still slaveholding states, right? So the balance at this moment, still in terms of number of states, still leans towards slaveholding states. New York doesn't abolish slavery until 1830, and then it's gradual abolition, so it takes a while. So that's the first one. The second one is actually a direct response to Pennsylvania saying in its act for the abolition of slavery that people who run away from slavery and manage to make it to Pennsylvania are free. And Massachusetts saying all persons are born free and equal, which also suggests that people who run away from slavery and make it to Massachusetts are free. The U.S. Sorry, that's the third one. I'll jump to the third one then. The third one is a response to that. Right? No person held to service or labor in one state, legally, under the laws in that state, escaping to another, shall be discharged from their service or labor. So the Constitution contains a fugitive slave clause. Enslaved people who run away from their state, even if they get to a free state, even one with a law that says they're free, are not free under federal law, and federal law, of course, supersedes state law. Now, what the Constitution fails to do, as it so often does, is fill in any of the details. There's no plan to enforce this in 1798 or 89. Right? There's no explanation. This is it. And then we move on to a different topic. Right? So, Constitution says Pennsylvania's clause about freedom for runaway slaves is illegal. But not much happens to Pennsylvania in the next 60 years to indicate they can't continue to let people be free. Right? So this is one of these things that is going to lie dormant, and I promise you we will pick it up again later as it becomes a major political issue. Right? But this is like, yeah, it makes the slaveholding states happy, but nobody's actually going to force the free states to do anything with it, so we're moving on. Article 4 is very much a moving on of the whole Constitutional Convention. They've been in Philadelphia all summer. It was hot. It was miserable. They were sick of each other. They just want to get the thing done. So it's like, here's all the stuff we haven't talked about yet, and we'll figure it out later. Even Article 3 about the judiciary is kind of like that. Moving back to Article 1, the powers of the legislature, which is much more detailed. They spend a lot more time on this. The migration or importation of such persons. Right? So migration suggesting choice, perhaps, on the part of the person. Importation, not choice on the part of the person being brought. As any of the states shall now existing, think proper to admit, shall not be prohibited by Congress prior to the year 8,808. Right? Translating the lawyer speak. Right? Prior to 1808, Congress is not allowed to end the transatlantic slave trade. Doesn't say the transatlantic slave trade ends in 1808. It can end in 1808. And Congress does, in fact, go ahead and do that. But the idea here, because a lot of the states were pressing for... Jefferson was not speaking out of left field when he criticized the king in the Declaration for continuing the slave trade. A lot of Enlightenment thinkers, like Jefferson, had questions about the morality of the transatlantic slave trade. That's a broadly held concern and conversation at the time. And a lot of people in the Constitutional Convention said, you know, it's kind of not the best look for us as a nation founded on a claim of liberty to keep participating in the transatlantic slave trade. It's just icky, right? Good or bad, whatever, it's bad PR, right? And also, we don't need it. We have enough people here to do the work that needs to be done. And even states like Virginia and North Carolina are sitting in the Continental Congress saying, yeah, we could do without the transatlantic slave trade. We have enough slaves. And our slaves have children, so the next generation will have enough slaves. And actually, we have more slaves than we need, and we make some money selling them to places like South Carolina and Georgia that are still really heavily involved in the transatlantic slave trade. And so maybe we'd make more money if we closed the transatlantic slave trade. And the part of this they don't mention at all is that there is still a reverse direction trade of Native Americans being captured in a lot of these southern states and sold to the Caribbean as slaves. That's dying out, by the time of the American Revolution because it's been so successful that there's not a lot of Native people left on the eastern seaboard to enslave, but it still exists. So it's a mixed bag, again, it's sort of about the morality and the motives of the people who supported this. But the point is there's a lot of people in Congress who think, in the Constitutional Convention, who think the United States should get out of the transatlantic slave trade. And again, a compromise is made. And we're going to have this 20-year window where you can import whoever you want. And you see this like ramping up of the slave trade in and out of Charleston as people are trying to get as many slaves as they can before the door shuts. And actually both the United States and Great Britain shut that door in 1808. Right? And it's never firmly shut. There's plenty of smuggling, and also technically the Spanish Empire still practices the transatlantic slave trade for a while. And then when the Spanish Empire collapses, the Brazilians, the Portuguese Empire and the Brazilians are still in it heavily. But it trickles, decreases significantly after 1808, and particularly after the British Navy starts really enforcing their ban on the transatlantic slave trade. They decide it should just apply to everyone, and they have the Navy to make it happen. So after about 1830, it's increasingly difficult to smuggle slaves from Africa.
So is the issue essentially a contrast between the ethical and the economic?
Yes, but that's maybe oversimplifying it because there's an economic component here as well. Again, there's money to be made in the domestic slave trade, and the transatlantic slave trade keeps the price of slaves quite low. So if you shut the door, and then if you are someone in Virginia who's like Thomas Jefferson, who strategically sells about half of the girls born on his plantation when they're in their teen years, keeps the boys because he also has a nail factory and he puts them all to work there. You can make money in the domestic slave trade if the transatlantic trade is shut. There's also some pro-slavery activists who want to make slavery the best possible institution and the most humane possible institution, who say if slave labor is more expensive, right? Which again, shutting the transatlantic slave trade means it's harder to get new slaves, and therefore the price of the value of the ones you have will go up, economically speaking, right? But also perhaps, hopefully, morally speaking, right? That slaveholders will take better care of their slaves if they're not as easy to replace. So there are economic and moral arguments on both sides. And those are being made, right? This is a conversation people are having. Ultimately, though, right, for the rice planters of the coastal Carolinas and Georgia, who are making money hand over fist, selling because they're the only people in the game selling rice, their indigo market dried up because they primarily sold indigo to the British Navy, who are now, not buying from the Americas. They've set up an indigo operation in India instead. But the rice is still a high demand crop in the Caribbean. Despite whatever tariffs might be in place, if you're a sugar planter in the Caribbean, your slave laborers want rice as their food crop, and the easiest way to get it is to buy it from South Carolina. The only way to get it, unless you get it from Africa. It's a lot easier to get it from South Carolina. And so those planters is the wealthiest part of the country by far, right? And money matters in politics, right? And so those planters have a lot of pull and convince everyone, give us time, right? We'll discuss it again, we'll consider it again, but give us time to get in all the Angolans we need to keep the rice plantations going. Okay. Any other questions? So all three of these things represent compromises. And as I said, the first has the most sort of consistent effect because it shapes representation for 80 years. The second actually Congress does in 1808, again, close the slave trade. Right? And the third really becomes an issue in the 1850s. So we'll talk about the third one again, definitely. Okay. So, sorry, go ahead.
You said that the Brits, as well as us in 1808, what's the appeal of 1808 specifically?
So, 1808 is the first time the U.S. Congress is allowed to, right, because that's what's in the Constitution. I think it's 20 years, right? It's 1798. Or 1788, sorry. And so Britain, there's two things. There's a series of legal cases in Great Britain in 1807 that sort of suggest the courts may be about to do it. And I think Parliament wants to do two things. They want to beat the courts because they want to be in control. They want to beat the United States because they want to prove their superior morality to their former colony. Right? Yes. Well, and Wilberforce really picks up more, is more of a force to be reckoned with in the 1830s, but it is sort of one of his early stages, I think. Yeah. So I think it's both for Parliament that they're, and technically, it's a quick. One of the laws is the British law is passed in 1807 but doesn't go into effect until 1808, and the American law is passed in between the two, so they still get to fight over who did it first. So we finally have a country. Here we go. We've founded the country. We've made a constitution. This one's going to stick, at least for the foreseeable future. And now, we've established that there are these places in the country that are not going to have slavery. Right? They either never did, like the Midwest, or they've phased it out, like the New England and Mid-Atlantic regions. Or eventually they do phase it out. Now we have to talk about how there becomes a place where slavery is so firmly entrenched that people cannot imagine letting it go. Because that was not the case in 1789, when the Constitution was written. There are people from the Carolinas saying, well, if the rice crop fails, we can talk about getting rid of slavery. They say that. But what we also know is that every time they had a choice, they found a crop or a plan or a way to keep slavery. Right? So they weren't likely to get rid of it, but they said that was a possibility. Right? Here's the moment. Shortly after the writing of the Constitution, we have two crucial pieces of technology. In 1793, Samuel Slater opens the first textile mill in North America with plans he smuggled out of Great Britain and starts making thread out of plant fibers. Right? In England, they were making the thread out of wool. In North America, he does some wool, but he also experiments with flax and with the long staple cotton that grows so well along the coast of South Carolina. At the same time, Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin. So, 1793, crucial year in this story. The cotton gin, as some of you probably know from personal experience, makes it possible to separate the fibers of the short staple cotton from the seeds that it's enmeshed in, right? Those prickly, sticky, difficult to work with cotton balls of short staple cotton that will grow throughout the interior of the South. And all of a sudden you have a market for a cotton crop and a way to process a cotton crop. There's no point in growing that stuff until you have at least a way to process it, but ideally also somebody who wants to buy it, or at least no reason to grow it in vast quantities. Right? Grow enough to spin your thread to make your 2 outfits a year for your household, but not in as a cash crop, unless somebody wants to buy it. Right? Since these two simultaneous technological advances that make the cotton crop a thing that matters. And I have the hardest time breaking my freshmen, intro U.S. history students, of the notion that cotton was always the crop of the Carolinas. They cannot get it in their heads. And when I teach the colonial economy, I never mention cotton. I tell them the 2 key crops in South Carolina are rice and indigo. And North Carolina's main economic activity in the market economy is shipbuilding. And yet, at least half of them will tell me that cotton was the most important crop of the Carolinas in colonial America, because it's just so firmly identified that you can't get it out of your head, right? This is the point when it actually becomes true that cotton is the crop of South Carolina and large portions of North Carolina.
Where was the first mill?
Slater's Mill in Rhode Island, Patuxent, Rhode Island. And New England gets the mills. They have the geography for it. You need all these mills early on are turned by water wheels. So you need a river that moves fast enough throughout the year to keep the wheel going. Right? Our rivers around here would not work. New England's rivers are narrower and rockier and move more rapidly and have snow runoff to keep them going through much of the summer. It's also the case New England has never had a cash crop. If you want to make money there, you have to go into other, sort of a diverse array of economic activities. Right? So people are already kind of used to that. Like, what else can we do to make some money? And young men who want to be farmers leave and go elsewhere. And so there is a significant population of unmarried young women who are never going to get married. And they need things to do to earn a living and take care of themselves. And so those mills become an employment for them. And it's not a huge leap, because they were the ones who were weaving, who were spinning the thread and weaving the cloth at home. And first they do it kind of by piece, and then they go and do it in the factory for the market. And so that's the short answer for why New England becomes the center of manufacturing. Right? There's always manufacturing in the southern states, but it's not this kind of like big mill textile manufacturing in particular. But there is some stuff, like tobacco processing happens usually very local, because it doesn't make sense to transport at huge distances. You don't need the same type of river. You need other stuff that you have here. So we will see manufacturing pick up in the South, but as I'll show you a map of, it's very uneven, right? And it's certainly the center of industry in the antebellum Americas is going to be New England and parts of the mid-Atlantic. We have to jump forward 20 years for the other part of this equation. In the aftermath of the Creek War, which is a civil war of the Creek Nation, who primarily inhabited central western Georgia and most of what is now the state of Alabama and northern Florida. The Creek people had this internal dispute over leadership and direction as a nation, and Andrew Jackson decided to insert the U.S. Army for reasons that are unclear to anyone except perhaps him, but he was sanctioned by the U.S. government to do it. He kind of did it, and then they're like, oh yeah, you can do that, that's okay. Maybe not a bad idea. Over this question of territory, right? So in 1814, at the end, in the midst of the War of 1812, the Creeks think this might be the time to kind of wage a rebellion, but also they end up going to war with each other. And in the aftermath in 1814, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix in Georgia is signed and gives the United States government a huge portion of the Creek territory. All of this Creek territory becomes now open for settlement for Euro-Americans, right? Becomes essentially the state of Alabama. Right? And also in the Treaty of Fort Stanwix is access to build roads through the rest of the Creek territory, which just sets in motion down the wheels down the line for the U.S. government to claim more and more and more of the Creek Nation. So the other element in the creation of the Cotton Belt is the beginning stages of taking what becomes much of Georgia, right? Georgia in the Revolutionary era is basically the coast and the lower half of the Savannah River Valley, right? But the interior of Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi become open to settlement sort of starting in 1814 with the Creek War and expanding from there over the next 20 years. And so that is the sort of the other key element in the equation of the Cotton Belt and its origins. Without those states, it's unclear whether South Carolina would have had the same ability to kind of present cotton as this thing. And in fact, by the time of the Civil War, right, this is really where the money is, economically speaking. The Mississippi River Valley and its cotton belt, the Black Belt, is the money zone. Right? So all of that gets us just about to noon. We have a couple of minutes for any additional questions. But that sets us up, right? These two parts of the country that have decided to not have slavery anymore, to phase it out, right? Or not have it at all. Right? And this other part of the country that's going to become more and more committed to slavery as both an economic institution, but also the thing that is then kind of the foundation of all of the aspects of legal culture and society in ways that people can't imagine a world without it. So that hopefully sets the stage for the next 2 weeks. Question?
What became of long staple cotton?
It's still grown. It is a luxury good. It's still grown even today, and is highly sought after. It's much higher quality cotton. It's the thing you use to make really fine, high quality textiles, but it's much harder to work with. So you need to be very specialized. I mean, it's easier to get off the thing, the seed, but it's so soft and silky that you really, it's still a thing you do by hand. So much like any other thing that you can start making by machine in this era, I often talk with my students about shoes, right? Instead of learning to craft a shoe from a piece of leather, every person learns one little piece of the process, and it's less skilled, but it's also quicker and therefore cheaper. And for most consumers, the quicker, cheaper one is the one you get, because maybe now you can have 3 pairs of shoes instead of 1. But the wealthy people will still be able to buy the highest quality version, right? And that's also the case with things made of long staple cotton. Right? It's what you like. Your special sheets in your trousseau are made of the long staple cotton, and you use them on your wedding night, kind of thing. Your fancy tablecloths, but it's not your day-to-day wear. Does that make sense?
Are you telling us that if cotton was not a crop, that slavery would have been phased out sooner?
Well, there are historians who claim that. There are others, particularly if we look at kind of the process by which South Carolina came to rice as its cash crop in the late 1600s, that was like they were looking for the thing that was going to make slavery work. And if it hadn't been rice, it would have been something else. And I think the same is true. If it hadn't been cotton, it would have been something else.
Would it? Really?
Likely. It's not clear what else, because I don't know what would have made the same buckets of money. Right? But wheat was an incredibly profitable cash crop in Virginia. Right? Tobacco was not making the money it was by the time we hit the 19th century. But Virginians were still committed to slavery, and they were using it for a very profitable wheat crop, as well as things like the mining and production of iron. Right? Certainly, you know, the new bright leaf tobacco that gets developed in North Carolina in the middle of the 19th century could have been the thing instead. So I don't know. Huh? Sugarcane is really hard to grow in North America. There's a section, it's very valuable where it does, right? There's a section of Louisiana that in the aftermath of the Haitian Revolution, these planters from Louisiana planters from Haiti flee to Louisiana, set up a sugar crop. They always have to fight the weather. It's not quite warm enough, particularly in northern Louisiana, to really grow sugar as easily as they had in the Caribbean. Right? So it's not clear that it would have spread much beyond where it did. Right? Once Florida becomes part of the United States, you get some sugar cane there. Right? But it's really hard to grow in most of North America. Parts of Texas, it works. Right? So again, it's a bucket load of money if you can do it, but it's tough. So, all right, yes?
Let's take us all the way back to your very first slide
Uh-huh.
about Thomas Jefferson.
Yes.
So the whole slide talks about the terrible things the king is allowing to happen in this transatlantic slave trade. But Thomas Jefferson owned 200 plus slaves.
Right.
So how is he reconciling his own activities with those being allowed by the king?
As men of his time did, you know, we always talk about, do we judge people by their time? Do we judge people differently? Jefferson was of his time, but liked to think he was better than everyone else of his time, so maybe we should have higher expectations of him. Jefferson inherited his slaves from his father and his wife. They were all born here. So he is not guilty of the sins of the transatlantic slave trade, and maybe he recognizes, look, the king didn't start this, but the king has actively chosen to continue it and needs to be held accountable for that, right? That is the constant conversation that I imagine must be going on in Jefferson's brain, of some as well self-justification, because Jefferson says all of that and then also writes notes on the state of Virginia, which gives us the first version of what we might call a scientific rationale for racism. Right? So, as one of my grad school mentors said, Jefferson is deeply conflicted. Great question. Anything else? All right, we will talk about the impact of all that cotton manufacturing next week.
The term deeply conflicted. That's I sitting over there. The simplicity with which I entered this room is now greatly challenged. And I'm deeply appreciative of that, as always, my dear. Go in peace.